On June 17, 1998, a state park ranger making his routine morning rounds at Lake Monroe in southern Indiana noticed something unusual in the gravel parking lot at the far end of Miller Beach Access Road. A blue Honda Civic sat alone beneath the shade of towering sycamore trees, windows rolled up tight against the summer humidity, undisturbed except for the morning dew that had settled across the windshield like a veil. The ranger approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the loose stones, and peered through the driver's side window. What he saw made his stomach drop. The keys dangled from the ignition, glinting in the early light. A brown leather wallet sat prominently on the passenger seat, its contents visible through the clear plastic window of the ID holder. But there was no driver, no sign of anyone at all. When the ranger circled the vehicle, he noticed something else that would haunt investigators for more than 2 decades. A single muddy boot print on the driver's side floor mat. Still damp, still fresh, the tread pattern pressed deep into the rubber surface. That boot print did not match the shoes of the man who owned the car. It did not match anyone the man knew. And the man himself, a 34-year-old elementary school teacher named Edward Adams, had vanished into the thick Indiana woods without leaving behind a single clue about where he had gone or why. If you are captivated by cases where the truth hides in plain sight for decades, where families wait in agonizing silence for answers that may never come, and where justice arrives only after the passage of time reveals what investigators missed the first time, then subscribe to Forbidden Crime Files. We dig deep into the cold cases that refuse to stay buried, the mysteries that haunt communities long after the headlines fade, and the breakthroughs that finally bring closure to those who never stopped searching. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the cases we cover here do not follow predictable paths. And the truth is always more complex than it appears. Edward Michael Adams was not the kind of man who inspired worry. He was dependable in the way that small-town teachers often are, the kind of person parents trusted with their children and colleagues relied upon to show up early and stay late. He had grown up in Bloomington, attended Indiana University just a few miles from his childhood home, and returned after graduation to teach 4th grade at Monroe Elementary, the same school he had attended as a boy. His students adored him for his patience and his willingness to explain fractions and long division as many times as necessary, until every child understood. His colleagues respected him for his dedication and his quiet humor, the way he could diffuse tension in faculty meetings with a well-timed joke or a thoughtful observation. Edward lived alone in a modest rental house on the east side of town, a 2-bedroom bungalow with a small front porch where he would sit on summer evenings grading papers and watching fireflies rise from the grass. He had never married, though he had been engaged once in his late 20s to a woman who eventually moved to Chicago for work and never came back. He did not seem particularly bothered by the solitude. He filled his time with lesson planning, hiking the trails around Lake Monroe, and volunteering at the public library on weekends, where he read picture books to groups of wide-eyed children who sat cross-legged on the carpet and hung on his every word. To everyone who knew him, Edward was steady, predictable, and utterly unremarkable in the best possible way. But beneath that calm exterior, there were tensions that most people did not see, fractures in his family that had never fully healed. Edward had an older brother named Michael, and the two had not spoken in more than 3 years. The estrangement between Edward and Michael Adams was the kind of family rift that starts small and grows into something immovable. Michael was 5 years older than Edward, a construction foreman who had built a successful business framing houses and commercial buildings throughout Monroe County. Where Edward was soft-spoken and thoughtful, Michael was loud and blunt, the kind of man who said exactly what he thought and never apologized for it. Their father had died of a heart attack when Edward was still in high school, leaving behind a modest life insurance policy and a house that was nearly paid off. Their mother had passed away 4 years later from complications related to diabetes, and it was in the aftermath of her death that the brothers had their falling out. There had been disagreements about the estate, about who should inherit what, about whether the family home should be sold or kept. Edward had wanted to keep the house, to preserve it as a place where future generations of the family could gather. But Michael had insisted on selling it immediately to divide the proceeds. The argument had escalated into something uglier, accusations about who had done more to care for their mother in her final years, who had sacrificed more, who deserved more. In the end, the house was sold, the money was split, and the brothers stopped speaking. Edward threw himself into his teaching. Michael threw himself into his business, and the distance between them grew until it seemed permanent, a chasm neither was willing to cross. By the spring of 1998, they had not exchanged a single word in over 3 years, and most people who knew them had stopped asking if they would ever reconcile. June 14th, 1998, was an ordinary Sunday afternoon at Monroe Elementary. The school year had ended 2 weeks earlier, but the faculty had gathered for an end-of-year meeting to discuss curriculum changes for the fall and to celebrate another successful term. Edward arrived just before 2 in the afternoon, parking his blue Honda Civic in the staff lot and walking through the heavy double doors that led into the main hallway. The meeting lasted a little over an hour, covering routine administrative matters and plans for a back-to-school workshop in August. Several teachers mentioned later that Edward had seemed perfectly normal that day, engaged in the conversation, even volunteering to help organize the workshop materials. When the meeting ended around 3:15, Edward said goodbye to his colleagues, waved to the principal, and walked out into the bright June sunshine. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. He did not return home that evening. He did not call friends or family. He did not show up for a dentist appointment he had scheduled for Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, when Edward failed to appear for a meeting with the school district curriculum coordinator, people began to worry. His landlord checked the house and found it empty, everything in its place. No signs of struggle or disturbance. His car was missing. His wallet and keys were missing. Edward Adams had simply disappeared, and no one had any idea where he had gone. On the morning of June 17th, 3 days after Edward was last seen, the state park ranger discovered the abandoned Honda Civic at Lake Monroe. The location was significant. Miller Beach Access Road was not a popular area, not the kind of place where families gathered for picnics or where teenagers hung out after dark. It was remote, accessible only by a narrow gravel road that wound through dense forest and ended at a small clearing near the water. The parking lot rarely saw more than a handful of vehicles on any given day, mostly belonging to serious fishermen or hikers who knew the trails well. Edward had been known to hike in the area, so the location was not entirely surprising, but the condition of the car was deeply unsettling. The doors were unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition, turned to the off position, but not removed. The wallet on the passenger seat contained Edward's driver license, credit cards, and $63 in cash. His sunglasses were folded neatly on the dashboard. A half-empty water bottle sat in the cup holder. Everything about the scene suggested that Edward had intended to return to the car, that he had stepped out for a brief walk or errand and planned to come right back. But he never did. And then there was the boot print. The muddy impression on the driver's side floor mat was distinct. A work boot with deep treads and a chevron pattern across the sole. The mud was still slightly damp when investigators examined it, suggesting it had been left recently, possibly within the past day or two. but the print did not match the shoes Edward had been wearing when he left the faculty meeting. According to witnesses, Edward had worn brown loafers that day, casual leather shoes with smooth soles. The boot print belonged to someone else, someone who had been inside Edward's car, someone who might know exactly what had happened to the missing teacher. The investigation began in earnest on June 17th, the moment the ranger radioed in the abandoned vehicle. Monroe County Sheriff's deputies arrived within the hour, cordoning off the parking lot and beginning a systematic search of the surrounding woods. Bloodhounds were brought in to track any scent trail, and volunteers from the community joined organized search parties that combed through the thick underbrush and rocky terrain around Lake Monroe. The search continued for days, expanding outward in concentric circles from the parking lot, covering miles of forest, ravines, and shoreline. Divers plunged into the murky waters of the lake, searching for any sign that Edward might have drowned or that his body might have been weighted down and submerged. But they found nothing. No clothing, no personal belongings, no indication that Edward had ever walked into those woods. The boot print became the focal point of the forensic investigation. Detectives photographed it from multiple angles, made plaster casts, and sent the images to the state crime lab for analysis. The tread pattern was identified as belonging to a common brand of work boot sold in hardware stores and farm supply shops throughout the Midwest. The kind of boot worn by construction workers, landscapers, and anyone who spent their days doing manual labor. The size was estimated at somewhere between a men's 10 and 11. But without a specific boot to compare it to, the print was just a clue without a suspect, a question without an answer. Investigators turned their attention to Edward's personal life, interviewing friends, colleagues, and anyone who might have seen him in the days leading up to his disappearance. The picture that emerged was of a man who kept to himself but was well-liked, who had no known enemies and no obvious reason to vanish. His bank records showed no unusual activity. His credit cards had not been used since the morning of June 14th, when he had stopped for gas on his way to the faculty meeting. His phone records revealed nothing suspicious, just routine calls to family friends and a few brief conversations with colleagues about summer plans. There were no threatening letters, no angry confrontations, no jilted lovers or disgruntled parents. Edward Adams appeared to be exactly what he seemed, a quiet, dedicated teacher who had simply vanished into thin air. But there was one person investigators were particularly interested in speaking with. One relationship that stood out as a potential source of conflict. Michael Adams, Edward's estranged older brother, had not seen or spoken to Edward in over 3 years, but that did not mean he was not a person of interest. Detectives visited Michael at his construction office on June 19th, 4 days after Edward disappeared. Michael was cooperative, answering questions without hesitation, expressing what seemed like genuine shock and concern about his brother's disappearance. He admitted that the two had not been close, that their relationship had been strained since their mother's death. But he insisted that the estrangement was not rooted in any real animosity, just stubbornness on both sides. When asked about his whereabouts on the afternoon of June 14th, Michael provided an alibi that was easy to verify. He had been at a construction site on the north side of Bloomington, overseeing the framing of a new commercial building, and multiple workers confirmed that he had been there from early morning until after 5 in the evening. Detectives asked if they could examine his work boots, and Michael handed them over without protest. The boots were photographed and compared to the print found in Edward's car. They were not a match. The tread pattern was different. The size was different. And there was no mud on the soles that corresponded to the type found on the floor mat. Michael was cleared as a suspect, at least for the time being, and the investigation moved on. As the summer of 1998 wore on with no new leads, frustration began to set in. Investigators re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined evidence, and revisited the woods around Lake Monroe multiple times, but the case yielded nothing. The boot print remained unidentified. Edward remained missing. Theories proliferated, each one more speculative than the last. Some believed Edward had staged his own disappearance, that he had grown tired of his quiet life and decided to start over somewhere new. But that theory did not account for the abandoned car or the wallet full of cash and identification. Others speculated that Edward had been the victim of a random crime, that he had encountered someone dangerous while hiking and had been killed or abducted. But there was no evidence of a struggle, no signs of violence, no witnesses who had seen anything unusual that day. A few people whispered about suicide, suggesting that Edward might have walked into the woods with the intention of never coming back. But those who knew him well rejected that idea outright. Edward had been planning for the future, talking about fall lesson plans, excited about a summer reading program he was helping to organize at the library. He did not fit the profile of someone contemplating ending his own life. By the fall of 1998, the active search for Edward Adams had largely ended. His case was officially classified as a missing person investigation, and detectives moved on to other cases, other crimes, other emergencies. Edward's face appeared on missing person flyers that were posted in shop windows and community centers throughout Bloomington. But as the months passed, those flyers faded and were eventually replaced by newer ones, newer faces, newer tragedies. The case went cold. For Edward's family, the years that followed were a kind of limbo. His aunt, a retired nurse named Dorothy, who had helped raise the boys after their father died, kept Edward's disappearance alive in the only way she knew how: by refusing to give up hope. She contacted the sheriff's office regularly, asking if there were any updates, any new leads, any reason to believe that Edward might still be found. The answers were always the same: no updates, no leads. The case was still open, but there was nothing new to report. Dorothy organized annual vigils at Lake Monroe on the anniversary of Edward's disappearance. Small gatherings where family and friends would stand in the parking lot where his car had been found and light candles and share memories. The attendance dwindled each year. People moved on. Lives continued. But Dorothy never stopped believing that someday, somehow, the truth would come to light. Michael Adams did not attend the vigils. He had retreated into his work after Edward disappeared, throwing himself into his construction business with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Those who knew him said he seemed haunted by the loss, burdened by guilt over the years of estrangement, tormented by the idea that he would never have the chance to reconcile with his younger brother. He rarely spoke about Edward, and when he did, it was with a tightness in his voice that suggested the subject was too painful to explore. Some people wondered if Michael knew more than he was saying, if the alibi he had provided was not as airtight as it seemed. But there was no evidence to support those suspicions. And eventually, even the whispers faded. The cold case period stretched on for more than 2 decades. Advances in forensic science came and went. DNA analysis became standard practice in criminal investigations. Cold case units were established in police departments across the country, dedicated teams that specialized in reopening old files and applying new technology to unsolved crimes. But Edward Adams' case remained frustratingly stagnant. There was no DNA to analyze, no biological evidence that could be tested or retested. The boot print was still the only physical clue, and without a suspect or a boot to compare it to, it was useless. Investigators who inherited the case would occasionally pull the file, review the evidence, and reached the same dead end that their predecessors had reached. The case became a cautionary tale within the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, an example of how even the most thorough investigation could be stymied by a lack of evidence and the passage of time. Edward's name was entered into national databases for missing persons, his dental records and fingerprints stored in case a body was ever discovered that might match his description. But as the years passed, hope faded. By 2010, most people who had known Edward assumed he was dead, that his body had been disposed of in a way that made it impossible to find, or that he had been buried somewhere remote and unmarked. Dorothy continued to hold her vigils, but the crowds grew smaller until she was often standing alone in that parking lot, lighting a single candle and whispering a prayer into the wind. Everything changed on a cold October morning in 2022. A hiker named Greg Fulton was exploring an area of the Hoosier National Forest, about 15 miles northeast of Lake Monroe, when he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Fulton was an experienced outdoorsman, someone who had spent countless weekends trekking through the backwoods of southern Indiana, and he prided himself on his ability to navigate terrain that most people avoided. On this particular morning, he was following an old logging road that had been overtaken by vegetation, barely visible beneath the fallen leaves and encroaching saplings. He noticed the remnants of a collapsed structure off to the side of the trail. What appeared to be an old hunting cabin that had long since fallen into ruin. The roof had caved in, the walls had buckled, and nature had begun to reclaim the space. Vines snaking through the broken windows and moss creeping across the rotted wood. Fulton would have walked past without a second thought, but something caught his eye, a flash of white among the debris. He approached cautiously, stepping over fallen beams and piles of moldering leaves, and when he got closer, he realized what he was looking at. Bones, human bones, partially buried beneath the collapsed structure, partially exposed by decades of erosion and decay. Fulton backed away immediately, pulled out his cell phone, and called 911. The recovery operation began that same afternoon. Forensic teams from the Indiana State Police arrived at the site along with investigators from the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. The area was carefully excavated, the bones removed piece by piece and transported to the State Forensic Laboratory for analysis. It quickly became clear that the remains belonged to a single individual, an adult male who had been deceased for a significant period of time, likely decades based on the degree of decomposition and the weathering of the bones. But it was during the excavation that investigators made another discovery, one that would crack open a case that had been cold for 24 years. Buried a few feet away from the remains, partially concealed beneath layers of dirt and decaying leaves, was a rusted metal toolbox. The hinges had corroded, the lock had broken away, but the box itself was still intact. Inside, investigators found an assortment of tools, screws, nails, and scraps of paper. Among those scraps were several receipts, faded and water-damaged, but still legible, each one bearing the name of a local hardware store and a customer account number. When detectives ran the account number through their database, a name came back that sent a chill through everyone involved in the investigation. The account belonged to Michael Adams Construction. The dental records confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. The remains found near the collapsed hunting cabin belonged to Edward Michael Adams. After 24 years, the missing teacher had finally been found. The discovery sent shockwaves through Bloomington. News outlets across Indiana picked up the story, and the case that had been all but forgotten suddenly became front-page news again. For Dorothy, now in her late 70s, the confirmation was both a relief and a heartbreak. She had spent more than 2 decades hoping that Edward was still alive somewhere, that he had simply chosen to disappear and would one day come home. Now she knew the truth. Edward had been dead all along, his body hidden in the woods just 15 miles from where his car had been abandoned. The discovery raised urgent questions. How had Edward ended up at that remote hunting cabin? Who had killed him? And why had the toolbox belonging to Michael Adams' construction been buried alongside his remains? Investigators immediately reopened the case, assembling a dedicated task force to re-examine every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every detail that had been collected back in 1998. The focus quickly turned to Michael Adams. Michael Adams was now 59 years old, still running his construction business, still living in Bloomington. When detectives arrived at his home on the evening of October 12, 2022, he appeared genuinely shocked by the news that Edward's remains had been found. He invited the investigators inside, answered their questions calmly, and expressed what seemed like sincere grief over the confirmation of his brother's death. But when detectives asked about the toolbox, Michael's demeanor changed. He acknowledged that the receipts were from his business, but he insisted that he had no idea how the toolbox had ended up at the site where Edward's body was found. He suggested that the toolbox could have been lost or stolen years ago, that someone else could have used it, that there were any number of explanations that did not involve him. Detectives were skeptical. They asked Michael to account for his whereabouts on the afternoon of June 14, 1998, the day Edward disappeared. Michael reiterated the alibi he had provided 24 years earlier. He had been at a construction site on the north side of Bloomington, overseeing the framing of a commercial building, and multiple workers had seen him there. Detectives made a note to re-interview those workers, to see if the alibi still held up after all these years, but they also pressed Michael on the estrangement between him and Edward, on the unresolved tensions over their mother's estate, on whether there had been any recent contact between the brothers before Edward disappeared. Michael admitted that the estrangement had been difficult, that he had regretted not reaching out to Edward, but he maintained that he had nothing to do with his brother's death. The investigation into Michael Adams intensified over the following weeks. Detectives combed through financial records, phone records, and business records dating back to 1998. They re-interviewed former employees of Michael Adams' construction, asking if anyone remembered Michael behaving strangely around the time of Edward's disappearance, if anyone recalled seeing the toolbox that had been found at the burial site. Most of the employees from that era had moved on, retired, or passed away. But a few were tracked down and agreed to speak with investigators. One former employee, a carpenter named Raymond Torres, who had worked for Michael for nearly a decade, provided information that shifted the entire direction of the case. Torres remembered the toolbox. He had seen it many times in the back of Michael's work truck, a battered metal box that Michael used to store miscellaneous tools and supplies. Torres also remembered something else. In the weeks following Edward's disappearance, Michael had seemed unusually distracted and agitated. He had been short-tempered with his crew, snapping at workers over minor mistakes, disappearing for long stretches in the middle of the workday, without explanation. Torres had assumed Michael was stressed about the business or dealing with personal issues. But looking back, he wondered if there had been something more sinister at play. Torres also recalled that the toolbox had disappeared sometime in the summer of 1998. He had asked Michael about it once, and Michael had brushed off the question, saying he must have left it at a job site and forgotten about it. Torres had not thought much of it at the time, but now, 24 years later, the disappearance of the toolbox seemed far more significant. Detectives also revisited the alibi that Michael had provided for the afternoon of June 14, 1998. They tracked down several workers who had been on the construction site that day and asked them to recount what they remembered. Most of the details aligned with what Michael had said. He had been at the site for most of the day, overseeing the framing work, talking to subcontractors, managing the crew. But one detail did not quite add up. A former foreman named Luis Herrera remembered that Michael had left the site for a period of time in the late afternoon, somewhere around 3:30 or 4. Michael had told the crew he needed to run an errand, that he would be back in an hour or so. Herrera could not remember exactly how long Michael had been gone, but he thought it had been longer than an hour, maybe closer to 2 hours. When Michael returned, he had seemed flustered, his clothes were dusty, and he had been unusually quiet for the rest of the day. Herrera had not mentioned this detail to investigators back in 1998 because no one had asked specifically about whether Michael had left the site at any point. The assumption had been that Michael was there all day, and no one had thought to probe deeper. But now, with Edward's body found and the toolbox linking Michael to the burial site, that gap in the alibi became critical. If Michael had left the construction site around 3:30, he would have had time to intercept Edward after the faculty meeting, to lure him to Lake Monroe, and to do whatever it was that resulted in Edward's death. The timeline began to come together. Edward had left Monroe Elementary around 3:15 on the afternoon of June 14, 1998. His car had been found 3 days later at Lake Monroe, approximately a 20-minute drive from the school. If Michael had left the construction site around 3:30, he could have intercepted Edward shortly after the faculty meeting ended. But how would Michael have known where Edward was going? Detectives revisited Edward's movements in the days leading up to his disappearance, looking for any indication that he might have planned to meet someone at Lake Monroe. They found nothing in his calendar, no notes in his planner, no phone calls or messages that suggested a planned meeting. But there was another possibility. What if the meeting had not been planned? What if Michael had been following Edward, waiting for an opportunity to confront him? The estrangement between the brothers had lasted 3 years, but unresolved family tensions have a way of simmering beneath the surface, building pressure until something finally snaps. Detectives theorized that Michael might have reached out to Edward in the days before the disappearance, possibly trying to reconcile or discuss something important. Maybe Edward had refused to engage. Maybe the rejection had triggered something in Michael, a resentment that had been festering for years. Or maybe Michael had never intended to reconcile at all. Maybe he had lured Edward to Lake Monroe under false pretenses, promising to talk things through, only to confront him with something darker. The toolbox was the key. Forensic analysts re-examined the rusted metal box, looking for any evidence that might link it definitively to Michael Adams. The receipts inside were from 1997 and early 1998, well within the time frame of Edward's disappearance. But there was more. Inside the toolbox, beneath the layers of rust and decay, forensic technicians found trace amounts of biological material. It was degraded, barely detectable, but it was there. DNA analysis was conducted, and the results were startling. The biological material contained DNA from 2 individuals. One profile matched Edward Adams. The other profile matched Michael Adams. The presence of both men's DNA in the same toolbox, buried alongside Edward's remains, was damning. It suggested that the toolbox had been used in some capacity during or after Edward's death, that Michael had been present at the burial site, and that he had been in close proximity to his brother's body. Detectives now had enough evidence to arrest Michael Adams on suspicion of murder. Michael Adams was taken into custody on November 3, 2022, more than 24 years after his brother disappeared. The arrest made national headlines, a cold case finally solved, a family secret finally exposed. Michael maintained his innocence, insisting that he had no knowledge of how the toolbox ended up at the burial site, that someone must have stolen it from his truck and used it without his knowledge. but the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA in the toolbox, the gap in his alibi, the testimony from former employees who remembered his strange behavior in the weeks following Edward's disappearance. All of it pointed to Michael's involvement in his brother's death. Prosecutors began building their case, preparing for a trial that would unravel the secrets of a family torn apart by resentment and greed. As the investigation deepened, more details emerged about the relationship between the brothers. Friends and family members who had been reluctant to speak in 1998 now came forward with information that painted a darker picture of the estrangement. Several people mentioned that Michael had been furious about the way their mother's estate had been divided, that he believed he deserved a larger share because he had been the one supporting her financially in her final years. Edward, by contrast, had been the one providing emotional support, visiting their mother daily, helping her with errands and medical appointments. The tension over who had sacrificed more had never been resolved, and it had poisoned whatever relationship the brothers once had. There was also the matter of the hunting cabin where Edward's remains were found. Detectives traced the history of the property and discovered that it had once belonged to their father. The cabin had been built in the early 1970s as a weekend retreat, a place where the family would go to fish and hike and escape the pressures of daily life. After their father died, the property had been passed down to Michael as part of the estate settlement. Edward had wanted to keep the cabin in the family, to preserve it as a place of memory. But Michael had seen it as a burden, an extra piece of property that required maintenance and property taxes. He had let the cabin fall into disrepair, visiting it only occasionally, eventually abandoning it altogether as the structure deteriorated. The fact that Edward's body had been buried near the cabin was not a coincidence. It was a statement. Whether intentional or not, Michael had chosen a location that was deeply tied to their family history, a place that represented everything the brothers had lost when their parents died. It was as if Michael had been trying to bury not just Edward's body, but the entire weight of their shared past, the resentments and disappointments and failures that had defined their relationship for so long. The trial of Michael Adams began in the spring of 2023, nearly 25 years after Edward disappeared. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and members of the Bloomington community who had followed the case for decades. Dorothy, now frail but determined, sat in the front row every day, her eyes fixed on the man who had once been her nephew, the boy she had helped raise after his father died. The prosecution presented a compelling case, laying out the timeline of Edward's disappearance, the evidence found at the burial site, and the inconsistencies in Michael's alibi. They called former employees to the stand who testified about Michael's strange behavior in the summer of 1998, about the missing toolbox, about the unexplained absences from the construction site. They presented forensic evidence showing that both Edward's and Michael's DNA had been found in the toolbox buried near the remains. They argued that Michael had lured Edward to Lake Monroe, confronted him about their unresolved family issues, and killed him in a fit of rage. After the murder, Michael had transported Edward's body to the hunting cabin, a place he knew intimately, a place where no one would think to look, and buried him alongside the toolbox that had inadvertently become a smoking gun. The defense tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case, arguing that the DNA evidence was inconclusive, that the toolbox could have been stolen or misplaced, that the gap in Michael's alibi was not enough to prove he had committed murder. They called character witnesses who testified that Michael was a hard-working businessman, a respected member of the community, someone who had no history of violence or criminal behavior. They suggested that Edward's death might have been the result of an accident, that he could have gone to the hunting cabin on his own, encountered some kind of mishap, and died without anyone knowing. But the defense could not explain how Edward's car ended up at Lake Monroe with someone else's boot print inside. They could not explain why Michael's toolbox was buried alongside Edward's remains. They could not explain the DNA evidence or the inconsistencies in Michael's story. The prosecution's case was circumstantial, but it was damning, and the jury found it convincing. On June 8, 2023, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on charges of second-degree murder. Michael Adams was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The aftermath of the trial was a mixture of relief and sorrow. For Dorothy, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but it could not erase the pain of losing both of her nephews, one to murder and one to prison. She gave a brief statement to the press outside the courthouse, her voice shaking but resolute. She said that Edward had been a kind and gentle soul, someone who had dedicated his life to helping children learn and grow, and that his death was a tragedy that should never have happened. She said that she forgave Michael, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because holding on to anger would only poison her own heart. She said that she hoped Edward could finally rest in peace, knowing that the truth had been uncovered and that justice had been served. For the Bloomington community, the resolution of the case was a reminder of how deeply buried secrets can shape and destroy lives. Edward's colleagues at Monroe Elementary held a memorial service in his honor, planting a tree on the school grounds with a plaque that read, "In memory of Edward Adams, beloved teacher and friend." His students, now adults with children of their own, shared memories of the man who had made learning feel like an adventure, who had believed in them when they did not believe in themselves. The case also had broader implications for cold case investigations. The discovery of Edward's remains and the subsequent arrest of Michael Adams demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence, no matter how insignificant it might seem at the time. The boot print that had been found in Edward's car in 1998 had never been matched to a suspect, but it remained on file, a silent witness that corroborated the theory that someone else had been involved in Edward's disappearance. The toolbox, buried and forgotten for more than 2 decades, had become the linchpin of the prosecution's case because forensic analysts had the foresight to test it for DNA, even though it was badly degraded. The case underscored the value of revisiting old evidence with new technology, of never giving up on unsolved cases even when years or decades have passed. It also highlighted the role that ordinary citizens can play in solving cold cases. Greg Fulton, the hiker who discovered Edward's remains, had not been looking for a body that day. He had simply been exploring the woods, following his curiosity, and stumbling upon something that would change the course of an investigation. His decision to call 911 rather than walking away had set in motion a chain of events that brought justice to a case that had been cold for nearly a quarter of a century. Edward Adams' story is a reminder that justice is not always swift, but it can still arrive. For 24 years, his family lived with uncertainty, haunted by the question of what had happened to the man they loved. For 24 years, his killer walked free, living a normal life, running a successful business, perhaps believing that he had gotten away with murder. But the truth has a way of surfacing, even when it is buried deep in the woods, hidden beneath layers of dirt and time. The tools that were meant to build and create became the instruments of revelation, linking a brother to a crime he thought he had concealed forever. The family cabin that was supposed to be a place of refuge and memory became a tomb, a silent witness to betrayal and violence. And the small-town teacher who had spent his life helping children learn to read and write and dream became a symbol of the persistence of justice. A reminder that some cases are never truly cold as long as someone is willing to keep searching for the truth. Michael Adams is currently serving his sentence at the Indiana State Prison. He has filed an appeal, arguing that the evidence against him was insufficient to support a conviction. But as of now, that appeal has not been successful. He continues to maintain his innocence, though few people believe him. Dorothy passed away in the fall of 2024, just over a year after the trial ended. She died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family, and those who knew her said that she seemed at peace in her final days, unburdened by the weight of unanswered questions. She was buried in the same cemetery as Edward, her gravestone placed just a few feet from his. A final reunion for the aunt and nephew who had both been shaped by loss and tragedy. The hunting cabin where Edward's remains were found has been torn down, the land cleared and returned to the forest. There is no marker at the site, no indication that it was once the scene of a terrible crime. Nature has reclaimed the space, as it always does, covering the scars of human violence with new growth and green leaves. For the students who once sat in Edward Adams' classroom, the resolution of his case was bittersweet. Many of them had grown up wondering what had happened to their beloved teacher, carrying memories of his kindness and patience into their adult lives. When the news broke that his remains had been found and that his brother had been convicted of his murder, those memories took on a new weight. They organized a fundraiser to establish a scholarship in Edward's name, a fund that would help students from Monroe Elementary pursue careers in education. The first scholarship was awarded in the spring of 2024 to a young woman who had been one of Edward's students in the late 1990s, who remembered him as the teacher who had encouraged her to believe in herself when no one else did. She used the scholarship to attend Indiana University, the same school Edward had attended, and she is now a teacher herself, working at a school just a few miles from Monroe Elementary. She says that every day she walks into her classroom, she thinks about Edward, about the lessons he taught her, not just about math and reading, but about compassion and perseverance and the importance of never giving up on the people who need you most. The Edward Adams case is also studied in criminal justice courses and cold case seminars as an example of how persistence and advances in forensic science can solve cases that once seemed unsolvable. The DNA analysis that linked Michael to the toolbox buried with Edward's remains was conducted using techniques that did not exist in 1998. Techniques that were able to extract and amplify genetic material from degraded samples that would have been useless 2 decades earlier. The case demonstrates the importance of preserving physical evidence, even when it does not immediately yield results. Because technology is always evolving, and what is impossible today might be routine tomorrow. It also illustrates the value of witness testimony, even testimony that seems insignificant at the time. The foreman who remembered Michael leaving the construction site for a couple of hours on the afternoon of June 14th had not thought to mention it in 1998 because no one had asked the right questions. But when investigators returned with more specific inquiries, that small detail became a critical piece of the puzzle, a crack in the alibi that allowed the entire case to unravel. The broader societal implications of the Edward Adams case are difficult to ignore. His death was not the result of a random act of violence or a crime of opportunity. It was the culmination of years of unresolved family tension, of resentments that were allowed to fester and grow until they became something toxic and unmanageable. The dispute over their mother's estate, the estrangement that followed, the refusal of both brothers to reach out and try to heal the rift. All of these factors contributed to a tragedy that could have been avoided. Edward's death is a reminder that family conflicts, no matter how petty they might seem, can have devastating consequences if they are not addressed. It is a reminder that forgiveness and reconciliation are not signs of weakness, but acts of courage that can prevent pain and suffering. And it is a reminder that the people we love are not guaranteed to be in our lives forever. That time is finite, and that the opportunity to make things right can disappear in an instant. For the investigators who worked on the Edward Adams case, both in 1998 and in 2022, the resolution was deeply satisfying, but also sobering. Detective Laura Simmons, who led the task force that reopened the case after Edward's remains were found, said in an interview that cold cases are some of the most challenging and rewarding work a detective can do. She explained that when a case goes cold, it is easy for everyone involved, investigators, family members, the community, to lose hope, to assume that the truth will never be known. But she also said that cold cases are never really closed, that there is always a chance that new evidence will emerge, that someone will come forward with information, that advances in technology will make it possible to re-examine old clues in new ways. She said that the Edward Adams case taught her never to give up, never to assume that a case is unsolvable, and never to underestimate the power of persistence and attention to detail. She also said that the case took an emotional toll on everyone involved, that spending months retracing the steps of a decades-old investigation, interviewing people who had spent years grieving and confronting the reality of a family torn apart by violence, was draining and difficult. But in the end, she said, it was worth it because Edward Adams deserved justice and his family deserved answers. The role of forensic science in solving cold cases like Edward Adams cannot be overstated. In 1998, DNA analysis was still a relatively new tool in law enforcement, and the techniques available at the time were limited. Samples needed to be fresh and plentiful in order to yield usable results, and degraded or contaminated samples were often impossible to analyze. But by 2022, forensic technology had advanced dramatically. Techniques like touch DNA analysis, which can extract genetic material from skin cells left on objects, and advanced PCR amplification, which can multiply tiny amounts of DNA to make them detectable, made it possible to analyze evidence that would have been useless 2 decades earlier. The toolbox found buried with Edward's remains was a perfect example. The DNA samples were degraded, contaminated by years of exposure to soil and moisture. But forensic analysts were able to extract enough genetic material to create profiles for both Edward and Michael. Without those advances, the toolbox would have been just another piece of circumstantial evidence, suggestive but not conclusive. With the DNA analysis, it became the smoking gun that tied Michael directly to his brother's death. The media coverage of the Edward Adams case also played a significant role in keeping the story alive and putting pressure on investigators to solve it. In 1998, when Edward first disappeared, the case received local attention but was quickly overshadowed by other news. By the time his remains were discovered in 2022, the landscape of media had changed dramatically. True crime podcasts, documentary series, and online communities dedicated to unsolved cases had created a culture in which cold cases were no longer forgotten, but actively discussed and investigated by amateur sleuths and journalists. The Edward Adams case was covered extensively by several true crime podcasts, which interviewed family members, analyzed the evidence, and speculated about what might have happened. Some of these podcasts reached audiences in the millions, bringing national attention to a case that had once been confined to a small community in southern Indiana. The public interest generated by the media coverage put pressure on law enforcement to prioritize the case, to dedicate resources to the investigation, and to pursue every lead until the truth was uncovered. While not all media coverage of cold cases is helpful, and some can be sensationalistic or exploitative, in the Edward Adams case, the attention helped to ensure that justice was finally served, there is also the question of what might have been. If Edward Adams had not been killed, if he had lived to see his 35th birthday and beyond, what kind of life would he have led? His colleagues and friends often wonder about this. Would he have continued teaching at Monroe Elementary, shaping the lives of countless children over the course of a long career? Would he have eventually married, started a family of his own, found the happiness that seemed to elude him in his younger years? Would he have reconciled with Michael, put aside their differences, and rebuilt the relationship that had been fractured by their mother's death? These are unanswerable questions, but they are worth asking, because they remind us of the profound loss that occurs when a life is cut short by violence. Edward was not just a victim, not just a name in a case file or a story in the news. He was a person with dreams and aspirations, with the potential to make a difference in the world, with people who loved him and needed him. His death robbed him of that future, and it robbed the people who cared about him of the chance to see what he might have become. The Edward Adams case also raises important questions about the nature of family, loyalty, and betrayal. Michael and Edward were brothers, bound by blood and shared history, by memories of their parents and their childhood, and the experiences that shaped them both. But that bond was not strong enough to overcome the resentments and conflicts that grew between them. In the end, Michael chose violence over reconciliation, murder over forgiveness. It is difficult to understand what could drive someone to kill their own sibling, to take a life that is so intimately connected to their own. Psychologists and criminologists who study familial homicide point to a variety of factors that can contribute to such tragedies. Unresolved trauma, perceived injustice, financial disputes, personality disorders, substance abuse, and a breakdown of communication and empathy. In Michael's case, it seems that the combination of financial resentment, years of estrangement, and perhaps a deep-seated need to assert control or dominance created a perfect storm that led to Edward's death. But even with these explanations, the act remains incomprehensible to most people. A violation of the most fundamental bonds that are supposed to hold families together. For those who study cold cases, the Edward Adams case is a textbook example of how patience, persistence, and technological advances can combine to solve even the most challenging investigations. The case was cold for 24 years, with no new leads and no apparent hope of resolution. But investigators never officially closed the file, and when Edward's remains were discovered, they were able to reopen the case with fresh eyes and new tools. The evidence that had been collected in 1998, the boot print, the witness statements, the photographs of the crime scene, all of it was still available, preserved in case files and evidence lockers, waiting for the moment when it would become relevant again. The discovery of the toolbox and the DNA analysis that followed were the breakthroughs that finally cracked the case. But those breakthroughs were only possible because the groundwork had been laid decades earlier by investigators who did their jobs thoroughly and meticulously, even when they had no way of knowing whether their efforts would ever pay off. The legacy of Edward Adams lives on in the people whose lives he touched. His former students, now adults, remember him as a teacher who made learning fun, who believed in them, who took the time to understand their struggles and help them overcome obstacles. His colleagues remember him as a dedicated professional, someone who cared deeply about education and about the well-being of his students. His family remembers him as a kind and gentle soul, someone who was taken from them far too soon. And now, thanks to the persistence of investigators and the advances in forensic science, his story has a conclusion. It is not a happy ending. There are no happy endings when a life is taken by violence. But it is an ending that provides answers. that brings justice, that ensures Edward's death was not in vain. His case has become a part of the larger conversation about cold cases, about the importance of never giving up, about the power of truth to emerge even after decades of darkness. And in that sense, Edward's legacy is one of hope, a reminder that even when all seems lost, justice can still prevail. If the Edward Adams case teaches us anything, it is that the past is never truly buried, that secrets have a way of coming to light, and that the pursuit of truth is worth the effort, no matter how long it takes. Edward's body lay hidden in the woods for 24 years. His killer walked free for 24 years. His family lived with uncertainty for 24 years. But in the end, the truth emerged. The toolbox that Michael thought he had buried forever became the evidence that convicted him. The hunting cabin that was supposed to be a forgotten relic became the site where justice was finally served. And the teacher who had dedicated his life to helping others learn became a symbol of perseverance. A reminder that some stories do not end until the truth is told. Edward Adams deserved better than the death he received. He deserved to live, to continue teaching, to find happiness and fulfillment in his life. But he also deserves to be remembered, not just as a victim, but as a person who mattered, whose life had value, whose story is worth telling. And now, finally, his story has been told.